A rare flower. A missing man. A secret soaked in lies. Welcome to Detective's Diary. I am your host Wyatt. Tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. Glad to have sharp minds like yours with us. Now, the case begins. You don't often get a man in a midnight blue cashmere suit showing up at the brownstone asking to not be heard, but that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning that was otherwise booked for silence and roast squab. I had just come in from a brisk round of errands, one dry cleaner drop-off, one baker pickup, and one exceptionally fine double espresso at Rusterman's when Fritz poked his head into the hallway with the kind of look that usually precedes either calamity or cuisine. "He won't say his name," Fritz murmured. That was good for a raised eyebrow from me. Fritz isn't the type to mistake eccentricity for anything more serious, so I knew something was off. I made my way into the front room where visitors were waiting and found a man with a waxed mustache, a trimmed goatee, and a pair of eyes that looked like they'd been pressed flat by too many secrets. He stood when I walked in, which was polite of him, but he didn't offer a hand. "I was told," he said, "that Nero Wolfe deals in difficult matters." "That's true," I said, "but his preferred matter is a steak, medium rare, with a side of silence." "What's yours?" He didn't smile. He reached into the inner pocket of that coat and pulled out a photo square, sepia-tinted, and just old enough to smell like someone's attic. It showed a woman with wide eyes and a crooked smile, holding what looked like an orchid of an unsettlingly dark hue, something you might find blooming under a full moon and regret picking. "I want to keep her out of the papers," he said. That was either a noble impulse or the preamble to a felony, but I played it straight. "Who is she?" "My sister." "And?" "She disappeared 6 years ago. Now someone is blackmailing me with that photo." I flicked my eyes from the orchid to the man. The flower looked odd enough to belong in one of Wolfe's upper-level greenhouses, though if he'd seen it before, he hadn't mentioned it over dinner. "What exactly are you being blackmailed about?" I asked. He sat down finally and his hand moved to the lapel, fiddling with an invisible thread. "I was a suspect in her disappearance," he said, voice level. "There was no proof. Nothing ever came of it. But the court of society doesn't require conviction, just suggestion." "Which brings you here," I said. He nodded once. "I want Mr. Wolfe to find out who's doing this, recover any copies of that photo, and ensure this ends quietly. I will pay his fee." "Name?" "I'd prefer Wolfe won't take a case from a silhouette," I cut in. "Name?" He hesitated, then said, "Lucian Hearth." That was a name. He could have said, "King of the Beekeepers," and I'd have gotten the same jolt. Hearth was money. Old money. The kind that funded botanical expeditions and had winged creatures etched into the family crest. I gave him another look and saw now the shoes, the ring, the way he sat like every chair owed him gratitude. "All right," I said. "Wait here." I went to the office, where Wolfe was engaging in the grueling ritual of staring at his beer foam. He didn't look up. "A man named Lucian Hearth is in the front room," I said. "He says someone's blackmailing him with an old photo of his sister holding a black orchid, maybe a dark red one. She vanished 6 years ago. He was a suspect. He wants quiet. He wants you." Wolfe finally looked at me. "Hearth? Lucian? Humph." He closed his eyes. He was 22 when his sister vanished. A summer scandal at a hunting estate in Ulster County. The girl was never found. Her name was Talia. I blinked. "You remember that?" I remember a photograph of her in Town and Country. She had the look of a Bronzino portrait and the eyes of a cat. The resemblance was noted, perhaps excessively so. He drummed his fingers once against the armrest, then sighed. "Bring him in." I went back to fetch Hearth. He stepped into Wolfe's office like a man about to be operated on. Wolfe gestured to the red chair, always the red one, and Hearth sat, tight-lipped. "You recall me, Mr. Wolfe?" he asked. "I recall your sister," Wolfe replied. "And I recall the silence that followed her vanishing. The absence was too perfect. Then you understand why I want this resolved." "You believe someone intends to revive the scandal," Wolfe said. "You intend to suffocate it." "Yes." "And you believe I will assist because I am discreet, intelligent, mercenary." Wolfe inclined his head. "I am also particular." He steepled his fingers. "Show me the photograph." Hearth handed it over. Wolfe examined it with the delicacy of a priest handling relics. His nostrils flared slightly. That meant something. The orchid had no ordinary bloom. "This flower," Wolfe said slowly, "is not a black orchid. It is a cultivar. Crimson, almost burnt. I do not recognize the pattern." That, coming from Wolfe, was almost a confession of ignorance. Which meant he was interested. "Archie," Wolfe said, "arranged a meeting with Theodore in the plant rooms at 4. I wish to speak to him about orchids." "About this orchid?" "No," he said dryly. "About cabbage." Lucian Hearth smirked at that, then caught himself. Wolfe handed the photo back. "Mr. Hearth, I accept your case. You will remain silent about my involvement. I will determine the source of the threat and neutralize it intellectually." "Thank you," Hearth said, standing. "That is all I want." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "So you say." He rang for Fritz, who ushered Hearth out. Wolfe closed his eyes again, and I knew the wheels were turning. Slowly, silently, like a phonograph winding up for something deep and operatic. "That orchid," he said after a beat, "should not exist." Which meant, of course, that someone had made sure it did. I said nothing. But I knew then this wasn't about scandal. It was about control. And someone had just stepped into the wrong brownstone. By 4 o'clock, the light in the plant rooms had shifted into that golden-green shade that makes you feel like you're trespassing in a cathedral for ferns. Theodore Horstman, Wolfe's orchid man and the second most territorial creature under our roof, was waiting with the reverence of a man about to be interrogated by the Pope and cross-examined by Darwin. Wolfe didn't keep him waiting long. I'd delivered the photograph an hour earlier, carefully slid between 2 pages of the Journal of Exotic Horticulture like a bookmark only a botanist would admire. Wolfe had sat with it for exactly 18 minutes, then summoned Theodore with a ring of the brass bell that sounded like it had judged humanity and found it lacking. Now we were all 3 of us in the plant rooms, Wolfe in his favorite iron-backed chair, Theodore at respectful attention, and me standing by the door with a notebook in hand and a pencil I wasn't actually using. The plants didn't mind the silence. They breathed in steam and mystery like it was Sunday afternoon air. Wolfe broke the quiet. "Mr. Horstman. Your assessment." Theodore cleared his throat in a way that suggested both preparation and apology. "It's a hybrid," he said. "But not one I've ever seen. The petal structure resembles Paphiopedilum lawrencinum, but the coloration deep crimson with violet margins doesn't match any known cultivar. It's exotic. Possibly synthetic. Synthetic, Wolfe repeated. In the sense of deliberate engineering, yes. Not artificial. But rare. Possibly one eophakind. Could it have been dyed? No, sir. The pigmentation is natural. It was bred for that color. And bred well. Wolfe didn't respond. He sat back, his lips pressed in a line that usually meant something more important than orchids was coming into bloom behind his eyes. I decided to stir the pot. Could a private collector have it grown? I asked. Theodore shrugged. If they had enough money and access to the right breeders. Thailand, Brazil, and parts of Malaysia. These hybrids can take years to develop. Years, Wolfe echoed. Then added, and yet this photograph is 6 years old. Theodore's eyes darted to mine and then away. Wolfe had a way of making people feel like they just misplaced a secret. So the timeline works, I said. The flower could have existed then. Yes, said Wolfe. But it should not have. That's Wolfe for you. Never afraid to contradict the universe if it's behaving improperly. He dismissed Theodore with a nod, and the man fled with his dignity intact and his shirt slightly damp. Wolfe turned to me. Archie. Yes, sir. Have Saul come by tomorrow morning. We will require discretion. Which means no Fred, no Ori. For now. I scribbled it in the notebook for effect. Then, when Wolfe didn't speak again, I asked, so what's next? He sighed. You will find the photographer. I blinked. There's no mark, no name. No studio. Nevertheless. That was Wolfe's polite way of saying I could either solve the problem or suffer through his version of motivational silence for a week. Fine, I said. Any leads? Wolfe pointed to the photo, still resting on the table. The composition is deliberate. The lighting is natural but angled. That is not a candid photograph. It was staged. Which implies trust. Which implies intimacy. Begin with Hearth's known associates. You're assuming he didn't take it himself? I am assuming Lucian Hearth does not stoop to soil his fingers with artistry. Point taken. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, then reached for the bell again. Also, he added, you will arrange a meeting with Miss Rowena Cray. I paused halfway through my scribble. And who is Miss Rowena Cray? He looked at me like I just asked what a steak was. She was Talia Hearth's music tutor. And the last known person to see her alive. Now that was a hook. I nodded, put away the pad, and went to make calls. It took 2 hours to find Rowena Cray. She wasn't in the phone book under her own name, but she was listed as a piano instructor through an upper-crust conservatory on East 74th. I told the secretary I was a private investigator with a delicate inquiry and managed to arrange a meeting the next morning in a little tea room off Gramercy. She arrived precisely on time, in a tweed skirt and a blue scarf that made her look like she'd stepped out of a British war film. Early 40s, composed, with the sort of voice that could quiet a room full of spoiled children with one raised syllable. Mr. Goodwin? She asked. In the tweedless suit, that's me, I said. Thanks for making time. I was told this concerned Talia. It does. We sat, and I let her order. She chose Earl Grey and a sugar cookie. I ordered black coffee and nothing else. Wolfe would have found it boorish, but this wasn't about pleasing his palate. I'm told, I said, you were the last to see her. I was the last to admit seeing her, she corrected gently. I liked her already. She was a troubled young woman, she went on. Beautiful, bright, and determined to disappoint everyone who loved her. That sounds like the beginning of a suicide note. It might have been. Or a novel. Talia kept both in her desk. You mean she wrote? Prose, poetry, piano. She tried everything. She hated all of it. Was there anyone she didn't hate? Rowena's eyes hardened, just a touch. Lucian. Her brother. Yes. He was her obsession. That raised an eyebrow. Not in the way you think, she added quickly. She wasn't in love with him. She wanted to be him. His life. His control. She envied him like it was her job. Did he know? Oh yes. And he used it. How do you use it? Rowena looked out the window. Talia told me once that Lucian said she could only make something of herself if she disappeared first. Like a magician's trick. She was obsessed with that idea. Erasure. Transformation. Dramatic. She was a dramatic girl. I paused. Then leaned forward slightly. Do you recognize this? I passed the photo across the table. Rowena's fingers trembled just slightly as she took it. She looked at it for a long time. Yes, she said softly. That orchid. Do you remember it? She brought it to me once. Said it was a gift from someone she wouldn't name. Said it had no name. From Lucian? I don't think so. It was different. She kept it in a glass case. Did she say who gave it to her? She said it came from the man in the greenhouse. Do you know who that is? She shook her head. No. I took the photo back. Would you be willing to come to Mr. Wolfe's office? Her eyes narrowed. The detective? The very one. She considered. Yes. But not tomorrow. I have students. I'll arrange something. She stood, finished her tea, and left with the grace of someone who never let a chair creak. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the rundown. He didn't look up from his glass of beer, but his eyes flickered at the phrase "the man in the greenhouse." That, he said, is poetic nonsense. Possibly, I said. Or possibly a clue. He grunted, then reached for the photograph again. I do not like being handed enigmas, he murmured. That's why they pay you the big bucks. He ignored that. The girl, he said, wanted to disappear. It looks that way. Then someone wants her to reappear. But only as an image. A memory. An accusation. And the orchid? Is the hook. Not the bait. That was Wolfe at his most elliptical. I left him to it and went to call Saul. Outside, the city rumbled on. But inside the brownstone, something rare was blooming. And this time, it wasn't in a pot. If Wolfe believed in omens, which he didn't, except when they involved changes to his dinner schedule, he might have considered what happened next a sign. The next morning, Fritz misplaced Wolfe's mustard. Not just any mustard. The special Dijon he imported quarterly from Lyon in wax-sealed crocks the size of baseballs. That stuff could peel the enamel off a less prepared tongue, and Wolfe swore by its ability to reveal character when paired with lamb. I mention it because disruptions in the brownstone have ripple effects. You think it's just condiments, but really it's the universe raising its eyebrows. At 9:03 a.m., Saul Panzer arrived looking like he'd slept in his coat and still managed to win a poker game in it. He wore his usual expression carefully blank, with the faintest hint of knowing too much. Wolfe, already in the office, motioned him to the red chair without ceremony. "I want a complete profile," Wolfe said. "Discreet, surgical. Begin with Lucian Harth's social circle. Include anyone known to be associated with Talia Harth before her disappearance." Saul nodded. "Blackmail target?" "Possibly." Wolfe handed him a typed list. Fritz had transcribed Wolfe's dictation that morning after the mustard incident and before the eggs Florentine. It included the names we'd already discussed and a few Wolfe had dug up from his archives. One name stood out even to me: Maxwell Bryce. "Maxwell Bryce," I said, pointing. "The gallery guy?" "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Owner of Bryce and Ellerman. Specialist in surrealist art and rare portraiture. He once commissioned a series of botanical-themed miniatures. One of them, I believe, featured an orchid." Saul raised an eyebrow, took the list, and left with a silent nod. When Saul gets quiet like that, it means the wheels are already turning in 5 different directions. I had my own assignment. Wolfe sent me to pay a visit to someone named Collier Bain. If that name sounds like it belongs to a man who sculpts from ice or writes manifestos about architectural integrity, you're not far off. Bain was a trust fund philosopher who once published a book of essays on the inner mirror of identity. I knew that because I'd read a few pages once while stuck in a waiting room. It cured me of any desire to reflect on my inner mirror. Apparently, he'd been close to Talia, back when she was still collecting unfinished projects like some people collect matchbooks. Bain lived in a 4th-floor walk-up near Sheridan Square that reeked of stale incense and theoretical discussion. He answered the door in a kimono. I'm not making that up. A real silk kimono, cherry blossoms and all, tied loosely over pajama pants. "Yes?" he said, blinking like he was afraid I might ask him to do math. "Mr. Bain?" I asked. "Yes." "Archie Goodwin. I'm investigating a matter involving Talia Harth." He paled, and I mean that literally. The guy turned the color of congealed oatmeal. "She's dead?" "Presumed. Though not confirmed. I'm not here for the obituary page. I want to know about your connection." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "I loved her," he said. "In the way that people who fear permanence sometimes do. She was volatile. Like mercury on glass. Sounds poetic. I wrote several poems about her." "Of course you did." His apartment was an explosion of books, unfinished canvases, and one very large, very ugly fish sculpture in the corner. "When did you last see her?" I asked, staying standing because there was nowhere to sit. "The summer she vanished. She'd been fighting with Lucian again. Something about an inheritance. She said he was hiding something. She never said what." "Did she ever mention an orchid?" He blinked. "A crimson one?" "That's the one. She said it was a symbol. Of betrayal, or maybe freedom. She wasn't clear." "Did she ever say who gave it to her?" He looked at me like I'd asked him who invented silence. "No. But she was frightened. I'd never seen her that way. She left suddenly, left behind some of her things." "Like what?" "Journals. A few letters. I boxed them. They're in my closet. I didn't expect him to offer that. But then again, philosophers are unpredictable. Mind if I borrow them? No. But I want them back. Of course. He handed over a box wrapped in twine. It was heavier than it looked. She was trying to vanish, he said as I was leaving. But someone else made her vanish first. I thanked him and left, stepping over a sleeping cat in the stairwell on the way down. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was midway through his ritualistic midday sulk, which he called digestive reflection. I waited until he grunted, then handed him the journals. He waved me off and motioned for me to begin reading aloud. The entries were exactly what you'd expect from a 21-year-old with too much time and too many words reflecting on freedom, fear, mirrors, fire, hunger, masks, and orchids. But one entry caught Wolfe's ear. July 6th, I read. He says the orchid will be mine if I prove I can keep secrets. I asked if it was rare. He said it was priceless. And poisonous. Wolfe shifted. Continue. He gave me an address. But I burned it. It didn't feel safe. I told Rowena. She said I was being dramatic. Address, Wolfe muttered. We need that address. Burned, I reminded him. Pfui. He hated being reminded that people didn't behave according to forensic logic. I turned the page. There's a sketch of the orchid. And a name. Read it. Crimson Epiphany. Wolfe's eyes closed. That is not a real designation. No, but she believed it was. Wolfe tapped his fingers on the armrest. We now have 3 entities with meaningful connection to the victim. Lucian Harth, the brother. Rowena Cray, the tutor. Collier Bain, the confidant. And a 4th Maxwell Bryce who may have facilitated the image. I nodded. You think Bryce had the photo taken? It is a possibility. If Talia sought to reframe her identity before vanishing, a portrait would be a symbolic act. What's the angle? That is what we must discover. The bell rang. Fritz entered with a tray of beer, cheese, and a note. Wolfe took the note, read it, and passed it to me. It was from Saul. Bryce was in contact with Talia 6 weeks before she vanished. He paid an anonymous horticulturist for a rare orchid, delivery confirmed. Bryce's studio assistant remembers Talia visiting twice, once alone, once with an unidentified man. Wolfe was quiet. We have a timeline, I said. Not yet. We have a corridor. Whether it leads anywhere remains to be seen. I was about to say something clever, but Wolfe closed his eyes and said tomorrow, arrange a meeting with Bryce. Late afternoon. Here. You want him in the office? I want to see if he recognizes the orchid. I want to hear him lie. I knew that tone. Wolfe was circling. The suspects were coming into view. The office would soon become an arena. And somewhere in the shadows, the man who gave away Crimson Epiphanies was waiting to be named. It's one thing to track a man through back alleys and subway platforms and cigar smoke dens full of imported scotch and regret. It's another thing entirely to track an art dealer through the velvet-fingered maze of midtown galleries, gallery assistants, publicists, and collectors with opinions as loud as their cufflinks. Maxwell Bryce was somewhere between the two. The man had the scent of old money and new paint, clean lines, curated shadows, and a schedule that ran on the assumption everyone else could wait. Wolfe had instructed that Bryce be invited to the brownstone, but Wolfe's version of an invitation involves me doing the asking and Fritz preparing the tea service. So I put on my cleanest tie and went calling. Bryce and Ellerman occupied a narrow brownstone gallery just off Fifth Avenue, the kind of place that had one painting in each room and ambient jazz humming at a volume calculated to suggest class without joy. The woman at the front desk wore a black sheath dress, black-rimmed glasses, and an expression that said no one here bought with cash or asked questions. I gave her my card. "He's in a conference," she said, not even looking at it. I smiled. "Tell him Archie Goodwin dropped by. I'm a private investigator working on behalf of Nero Wolfe. And I only take 5 minutes." She did look up at that. The name Wolfe still has gravity in certain circles, especially ones where people lie professionally and get paid for it. She disappeared into the back. 3 minutes later, Bryce emerged himself. He was tall, late 40s, hair like brushed steel, and skin that hadn't seen direct sunlight since Roosevelt. He wore a suit the color of charcoal smoke and moved like someone who'd once studied fencing but gave it up because it interfered with his espresso. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. "This must be important. Wolfe doesn't usually fish in my pond." I gave him a smile. Maybe he's after a particular kind of koi. He didn't laugh. "Come in." His office was as minimal as the gallery: one desk, 2 chairs, a lamp, and a painting of a single red leaf floating over a black background. It looked familiar, but I didn't ask. I took the offered seat. "I'll get to the point," I said. "Do you remember a young woman named Talia Harth?" His eyes narrowed just a fraction. "She sat for a portrait, briefly. More a whim than a commission. That was years ago. 6, to be exact." He nodded once. "It never progressed. She vanished before I could finish the preliminary sketches. She posed with an orchid." His jaw tightened a half-inch. "I suppose she might have. She brought strange props. She wanted the portrait to symbolize, I believe the word she used was release. Do you remember the orchid? It was crimson. Dramatic. Not the kind one finds at florist shops. Did you provide it?" "Certainly not." "Did you photograph her?" "No," he said, with just a bit too much crispness. "I do not engage in photography. My work begins and ends with oils and canvas." I leaned back slightly. "Studio assistants say she came here twice. Alone for the first time. The second time, with a man they didn't recognize." "That's possible. Any idea who he was?" "I didn't see them. I was in Connecticut that week." "Convenient." He smiled, like a man used to smiling politely through conversations he no longer found amusing. "Mr. Goodwin. If I had anything of importance to offer, I'd be delighted to." "I have nothing." "Not even a guess as to who gave her the orchid?" "No. But if you find out, let me know. I'm always looking for new suppliers." I stood. "You'll be receiving a formal invitation from Mr. Wolfe. He prefers to host these little garden parties himself." Bryce gave a theatrical sigh. "Of course. I'll make time." "Bring a memory," I said. "It helps." When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the plant rooms. I found him there, watering with such meticulousness you'd think each drop was liquid gold. I gave him the rundown, keeping my tone flat but the facts clear. Wolfe didn't interrupt until I got to the part about the unidentified man. "Did Bryce lie?" he asked. Yes. But neatly. Define. He didn't blink at her name, but he tightened at the orchid. Denied everything else like he was reading off a card. Says he never photographs. Says he was out of town. But he didn't ask what this was about. Didn't act surprised. That means he already knows. Wolfe grunted. Sol? Still working. Says he's close on tracking the orchid supplier. Some whispers about a greenhouse in Morningside Heights. Unregistered. Private. Private greenhouse in Manhattan, Wolfe murmured. Costly. Exclusive. Or concealed. He adjusted a leaf with one thick finger. Will Bryce come? Tomorrow at 5. Wolfe nodded. Who else? I've reached out to Rowena Cray. She'll confirm by morning. Collier Bain is a toss-up. He's cooperative, but he may fold if you press too hard. He will come. He's the type. The type? Anxious to be understood. Wolfe left the leaf alone and turned to me. You must now see Lucian Hearth again. Probe his version of events. Ask him if he ever met Bain. And whether he knows the name, Crimson Epiphany. You think he'll admit anything? No, Wolfe said, but his refusals will be revealing. I found Lucian Hearth that afternoon at his club, where the walls were mahogany and the silence came with a surcharge. He was in a high-backed leather chair with a single glass of port on the table beside him. The man looked like he'd aged 2 decades since our last conversation, though his suit was still perfectly pressed. Mr. Goodwin, he said. What do you have for me? Questions. He motioned for me to sit. Do you know a man named Collier Bain? He paused. Yes. One of Talia's poet friends. She brought him to dinner once. I disliked him instantly. Why? He had the look of a man waiting for tragedy so he could write about it. Did she confide in him? Possibly. She was reckless that way. Did you ever give her an orchid? Hearth blinked. No. She had one. Crimson, hybrid. She called it Crimson Epiphany. He froze. I've never heard that name. But it means something. No, he said firmly. It doesn't. He drained the port and looked away. Mr. Hearth, I said, what did Talia want from you? He smiled bitterly. She wanted me to free her. From herself. From the family. From everything. Did you try? He didn't answer. Back at the brownstone, I reported the encounter. Wolfe was silent for a long time. Then he said she wanted freedom, but someone gave her disappearance instead. And now someone wants that silence broken. Why now? I asked. Why wait 6 years? That, Wolfe said, is the question that will lead us to the answer. He rang for Fritz. Tomorrow, he said, we will arrange the chairs. Let the players take their places. And just like that, the game began to shift. The suspects were no longer names on a page. They were people. And they were coming here. There's something about preparing Wolfe's office for a full suspect lineup that gives me the same feeling I used to get playing poker with strangers: cool air, warm tension, and the distinct sense that someone was going to fold. And unlike poker, Wolfe always stacked the deck before anyone sat down. The next day, the red chair was fluffed, the guest chairs polished, and the coasters precisely placed 1 inch from the chair leg, exactly where Wolfe preferred them. Fritz had brewed his special oolong, the one that smelled like someone had roasted a garden in a pine box. Wolfe sat, unmoving as usual, wearing a dark yellow cravat that clashed just enough with his waistcoat to serve as psychological camouflage. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. He was brooding in preparation. There's a difference. The first guest to arrive was Rowena Cray. She entered with the same poise she'd shown at the tea room, but with slightly firmer steps. Her hair was pinned back tighter, and her scarf was cream-colored today, the sort of shade people wear to funerals or committee hearings. Next came Collier Bain, looking like he'd emerged from a fog of forgotten thoughts and accidental metaphors. His blazer was too big, and his collar was open in a way that suggested he had once tried to wear a tie but talked himself out of it. He offered a nod to Rowena, which she didn't return. Maxwell Bryce arrived next on time, perfectly groomed, and wearing a smile so carefully constructed you could have hung it in his own gallery. He gave a shallow bow to Wolfe, which Wolfe ignored, and then settled in one of the guest chairs like he was expecting to be sketched. Lucian Harth came last. He brought with him an air of frost and an aftershave that smelled like exported confidence. He didn't look at any of the others and offered Wolfe a clipped good afternoon, which Wolfe returned with a soft grunt. "Thank you all," Wolfe began, opening his eyes. "Your punctuality is appreciated. You'd think it was a dinner party, the way they all sat up a little straighter." But then Wolfe went on. "Let us begin with a brief statement of fact. 6 years ago, Talia Harth vanished. The police failed to determine whether her disappearance was voluntary, coerced, or fatal. The matter has remained dormant until now." He paused to let that sink in. "Recently, a photograph has surfaced. It features Talia holding a rare, perhaps unique, orchid. Its existence is significant because it was not publicly documented, and because it predates her disappearance by a matter of weeks." He looked directly at Bryce. "Mr. Bryce, did you take this photograph?" Bryce kept his smile. "No, Mr. Wolfe. I do not work with cameras." "I am aware," Wolfe said. "Yet you provided her with studio space." A studio assistant recalls a second visit. "She was accompanied by a man. Do you recall this?" Bryce hesitated just a breath too long. "I was not present. But yes, I later heard she had returned." The assistant said she brought an air of finality. "Poetic," Wolfe murmured. "Mr. Bain?" Collier blinked, looking up from his nervous fidgeting. "Did Talia ever mention a man she visited Bryce's studio with?" "No. She didn't mention anyone by name." "Did she write about it?" "There was one entry about a promise being fulfilled. Something about the keeper of petals. I thought she was referring to herself." "Of course," Wolfe said dryly. Rowena Cray spoke up then, clear and calm. "Talia kept secrets like they were heirlooms. Beautiful and useless unless someone else envied them." Wolfe turned to her. "Did she ever speak of this photograph to you?" "No. But she showed me the orchid. She said it was a symbol." "A symbol of what?" "Independence. Or maybe revenge. She never told me which." Wolfe nodded and gestured toward me. I retrieved the photograph from the locked drawer and placed it on the table beside him. He didn't hold it up. He didn't need to. The orchid in question has been identified by Theodore Horstman as a hybrid with no recorded match. Its pigmentation is natural but unique. "Mr. Bryce, do you recognize it?" Bryce leaned forward and glanced at the image. His mask didn't shift, but something behind his eyes did. It is familiar. But I can't place it. Wolfe looked at Lucian. And you, sir? Lucian barely moved his eyes toward the photo. No. I've never seen it. Then allow me to suggest, Wolfe said, that one of you has. He let that hang. The tension in the room thickened just enough to make Fritz enter quietly with the tea cart, perform his duties with ghost-like elegance, and exit without being acknowledged. Wolfe leaned back. Now, he said. Let us discuss the matter of trespass. The room blinked collectively. Yesterday, Wolfe went on, a drawer in my office was found slightly ajar. A drawer that had been locked. Its contents had been rearranged. I didn't say anything, but he was telling the truth. I'd noticed it myself that morning. A subtle shift in the way the envelopes sat. One of them was bent where I distinctly remembered sealing it flat. No files were taken, Wolfe continued. But something was inspected. He looked around. No one here, save Mr. Goodwin and Mr. Panzer, has access to this office. Yet someone found a way to enter. That someone was seeking information. Possibly a copy of the photograph. Possibly a list of names. Rowena's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Bain was visibly sweating. Bryce maintained his marble composure, but his right foot began tapping small, precise, and nearly imperceptible. Lucian Harth, for his part, didn't move. Wolfe tapped the edge of the photo. This image is not merely a memory. It is a lever. Someone intends to use it to pry loose something buried. Guilt. Scandal. Inheritance. He turned again to Lucian. Mr. Harth, was your sister in your will? That got a reaction. Lucian's brow twitched. Yes, he said slowly. A modest trust. Was it revoked? Not officially. The assets were held in reserve. In case of her return. Wolfe nodded. Then her reappearance even in image complicates matters. He glanced toward the window, where the early evening light was turning gold and sharp. I will speak to each of you again. Separately. You will not leave New York without informing Mr. Goodwin. You will not attempt to destroy any personal correspondence, images, or keepsakes relating to Miss Harth. If you do, I will know. And I will consider it a confession. That was Wolfe's way of being polite. For him, it was almost tender. He rose, actually stood, and walked to the window. The meeting was over. Bryce left first, offering a nod that felt less like goodbye and more like acknowledgement. Rowena followed, silent but steady. Bain hesitated, then mumbled something about clarity and justice and finally stumbled out. Lucian lingered. Wolfe didn't turn. If you know something, Wolfe said, now is the time. Lucian's voice was low. I don't know anything. But I suspect something. And what is that? Lucian hesitated. That this has all happened before. And someone wants it to happen again. He left. I waited until the door clicked behind him before speaking. Well, I said, that was warm and fuzzy. Wolfe sat back down with a grunt. We are closer, he said. To what? To the truth. Or the edge of it. I looked at him. You think the trespass was Bryce? No. Bain? No. Then who? He didn't answer. But he reached for the photograph again. And this time, he flipped it over. There, faint and almost invisible under the yellow light, was a watermark. Tiny, cursive, and unmistakable S.G. I leaned closer. Saul? Wolfe shook his head. No. Not Saul. Then who? Wolfe stared at the watermark like it was a cipher. The initials, he said, do not belong to a person. And then he said no more. Which, coming from him, was practically a cliffhanger. The morning after Wolfe found the watermark with those dainty initials, S.G., curled on the back of the photograph like a cat in the sunni, found myself nursing a cup of coffee that had gone from strong to sour in the time it took Fritz to tell me he couldn't find the oregano. First mustard, now oregano. If you believe in signs, the pantry was warning us something ugly was coming. Wolfe, of course, didn't believe in signs. He believed in patterns, and patterns needed facts to emerge. So while the brownstone hummed its usual gospel of steam heat and rigid routine, Wolfe spent that morning in a state I like to call strategic silence. He wouldn't speak unless absolutely necessary. He wouldn't even grunt unless prompted. That meant I was left with the task of doing what he called turning over the compost, digging through the stinking mess of facts, half-facts, and fully weaponized gossip for something with roots. The watermark was the new star of the show. S.G. It doesn't belong to a person, Wolfe had said the night before, and when Wolfe says something doesn't belong to a person, you can bet your last tailored jacket it belongs to a place, a firm, or a mistake someone regrets. I started with the obvious. Studio galleries, photographic firms, orchid growers. I combed the business directories like a man combing through his ex-girlfriend's yearbooks, carefully, deliberately, and slightly embarrassed. Nothing. Nothing under S.G. in Midtown, Soho, or the Lower East Side. Not under florists, artists, or publishers. Then I hit something. Saul called in from a payphone near Columbia University. Got something you might like, he said. Tell me. S.G. stands for Scarlet Glasshouse. It was a private horticulture collective run out of Morningside Heights. Discreet. Invite only. They used a private greenhouse to cultivate rare hybrids, mostly orchids. Used to. Shut down 5 years ago. IRS investigation, foreign funding, suspicious bookkeeping. But no formal charges. Who ran it? On paper, it was anonymous. But it was hosted on the estate of an art patron named Serafina Galt. Galt? You heard me. Born money. Died quiet. No heirs, no will. The estate went to auction last year. The greenhouse is still there, untouched. I blinked at the phone receiver. You're telling me the Scarlet Glasshouse was real? As real as orchids and red tape. And if our orchid came from anywhere, it came from there. I hung up and turned to Wolfe, who hadn't moved an inch since breakfast. His eyes were half closed, but his right index finger was drumming on the armrest like a man waiting for his chess opponent to stop pretending. The orchid, I said, came from a place called the Scarlet Glasshouse. He didn't open his eyes. Of course it did. The greenhouse belonged to Serafina Galt. That got an eyebrow twitch. She was eccentric, I continued. Patron of the arts. Rumors say she ran the place like a salon for botanical obsession. No press. No visitors. Just private donors and curated plants. The place was shuttered after she died in some kind of funding scandal. Did she know Talia? No proof. But Bryce once mentioned showing at a Galt-sponsored exhibition. Could be a link. Wolfe exhaled, slowly. Talia sought control through symbolism. The orchid engineered, rare, red was her cipher. The glasshouse may have been the source, but it is also the stage. The stage? She vanished, Archie. Disappeared into an idea. The glasshouse may be where she rehearsed it. Want me to go see it? He nodded once. But take Saul. I do not trust abandoned estates to be abandoned. 2 hours later, Saul and I stood at the rusting gate of what had once been the Galt estate. It looked like a place that had survived not just time but disappointment. The house itself was cloaked in ivy, its windows boarded up. But the greenhouse, visible behind the main structure, still stood tall, curved, and shimmering faintly in the sunlight, like something waiting to breathe. The gate was locked, but Saul had a key to his version of one, anyway. 5 minutes later, we were inside, walking the path toward the greenhouse. The door groaned open with a creak I felt in my spine. Inside, the air was warm, damp, and full of the smell of old roots and dry glass. The plants were mostly dead/crumbled stalks, browned leaves, but a few stubborn green things still clung to life. Mosses. Vines. A single fern with ambition. Then Saul froze. Here, he said, pointing to a dusty shelf near the back. Among a line of clay pots, one still held a metal tag. The writing was faded, but legible. Crimson Epiphany, Hybrid Trial, SGL 13. It was real. Not just the orchid, but its name, its origin, its cataloging. Below the tag was an old envelope curled, water-stained, but sealed. I looked at Saul. He shrugged. I opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, another one of Talia, but different. In this one, she wasn't holding the orchid. She was planting it. No smile. No pose. Just the motion, hands in dirt, eyes downcast. On the back, scrawled in a quick, sharp hand, was one sentence: plant it deep, let it learn to breathe. We didn't speak on the way back. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe took the new photo and studied it for 20 silent minutes. He didn't ask where it came from. He already knew. This was meant for someone, he finally said. A message? A warning? Or a gift? He handed it to me. Show it to Rowena. She'll talk. She will now. Rowena Cray received me in her apartment that evening, neat, well-kept, scented faintly with old paper and clean linen. She didn't offer tea. Just a straight look and a question. You found it? I handed her the photo. She didn't react for a moment. Then her fingers tightened around the edges. She said she would leave proof, Rowena whispered. She said she couldn't just disappear without leaving a trail. Did she say what kind of trail? No. Just that it had to grow. I sat down across from her. Rowena, was Talia planning something? Something bigger than just running away? She talked in riddles. But yes. She said Lucian needed to be silenced, but not with noise. With memory. She said people don't fear ghosts. They fear being remembered. I scribbled that down. Do you think she's alive? Rowena looked up. I don't know. But you think someone else believes she is? She didn't answer. That was enough to answer. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting in the office, a fresh beer sweating beside him. I gave him the update. He listened without comment until I finished, then leaned back and closed his eyes. The photograph, he said, was not meant to be found. It was meant to be discovered. That's a distinction. It is the difference between evidence and provocation. I frowned. You think someone wanted us to know she planted the orchid? No. Someone wanted Lucian to know. Why? He opened his eyes. Because if she's alive, it means his silence has expired. And if she's dead, it means someone else is speaking for her. He picked up the new photo again and studied it in silence. Outside, the city went on pretending nothing had happened. But inside the brownstone, pressure was building. And something, somewhere, was getting ready to bloom. In the world of Nero Wolfe, things don't escalate through chase scenes or fistfights. They escalate through stillness. Wolfe doesn't slam doors or raise his voice. He simply closes his eyes longer than usual. He speaks more precisely. He becomes even more of what he already is, a man who conquers not by moving, but by making everyone else move around him. The day after our greenhouse expedition, the brownstone became noticeably quieter. Fritz stopped humming while he prepared lunch. Theodore didn't bring down any flower clippings from the plant rooms. And Wolfe, well, Wolfe didn't open a book all day. That, if you know the man, is as disturbing as finding a broken teacup in a locked cabinet. At 10:45 a.m., he summoned me to the office with one of those sharp, metallic bell rings that meant I shouldn't dawdle. I found him seated, as usual, but more alert than he'd been in days. The new photograph of Talia, the one we'd recovered from the Galt estate, rested on the desk in front of him, no longer tucked away in a drawer. "Archie," he said, not looking up, "we must now provoke." "That's a bold word," I replied, sliding into my usual chair. "Care to unpack it?" He gestured toward the photo. Someone placed that image in the greenhouse not to preserve it, but to ensure it would be found. The timing suggests it was recent, within the last month. The paper is aged, but the envelope bore signs of recent handling. A fingerprint in fresh skin oil, barely smudged. "You checked for prints?" "No," he said. "But Saul did." "Of course. So you think someone wanted us or Lucian to find it?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that someone intended to use Talia's memory as leverage. Against whom, we must still determine. But they've made their move. We shall make ours." He reached for a sheet of thick cream-colored stationery and began dictating a series of brief, formal letters. One to Maxwell Bryce. One to Rowena Cray. One to Collier Bain. And one addressed with particular care to a Mr. Aldous Van Gelder. I paused. Van Gelder? Wolfe didn't glance up. An art historian. Once wrote an exposé on the Scarlet Glasshouse, under a pseudonym, and then vanished from polite circles. He now works in restoration at the cloisters. You think he knew Talia? I think he knew Serafina Galt. And I think if anyone can tell us who funded the Glasshouse during its final years, it's him. I made the calls, sent the letters, and by noon the next day, all four confirmed. Bryce would arrive that afternoon. Rowena the next morning. Bain the same. And Van Gelder would come at Wolfe's specific request, no questions asked. That left only one party unaccounted for, Lucian Harth. He's slipping, I said, watching the last of the envelopes go out. He's either hiding something or bracing for impact. Wolfe didn't respond immediately. Then, finally, hearth is not our target. That gave me a pause. He's not the blackmailer. I said he's not the target. That does not mean he is innocent. Cryptic Wolfe was back. It meant the pieces were still shifting. Maxwell Bryce arrived promptly at 3, wearing a silk scarf and a smirk, as if he were here to judge the drapery. I led him to the office, where Wolfe waited with the usual chilled beer and the less usual intensity. "Mr. Bryce," Wolfe said, "you are aware, I presume, of the Scarlet Glasshouse's existence?" Bryce sat gracefully, fingers steepled. "Of course. I attended a few showings hosted by Serafina Galt. A curious woman. Overly fond of allegory. Did you ever visit the greenhouse?" "No. I was invited once, but declined. Something about rare hybrids and moral purity." Wolfe snorted. "You expect me to believe that a man in your profession curated symbolism, controlled aesthetics, passed on the chance to view one of the most private horticultural collections in Manhattan?" Bryce's smile froze just a fraction. "I had other engagements." "Did Talia Hearth go?" Bryce crossed one leg over the other. "She did. She returned with an orchid I had never seen before. Said it was her passport." "Passport to what?" "She never said." Wolfe gestured to the photo. "You saw this?" Bryce leaned forward. His expression didn't change, but I saw his pulse shift at the jawline. "I did not take this." "But you knew it existed." "I suspected." "She hinted she had documented the planting. I assumed it was poetic." Wolfe narrowed his eyes. "You said you had no contact with her in her final days. Yet you were aware of this image." Bryce hesitated. "I was told. By someone who found one of her journals. It mentioned me, briefly." "Who?" Bryce didn't answer. Wolfe didn't repeat the question. Instead, he rang for Fritz, who arrived with an envelope. Inside was a copy of the photograph. Not the original. Just enough bait. Wolfe handed it to Bryce. "You will not keep this," Wolfe said, "but I want your opinion." Bryce studied it. "It's staged. But not by a professional. The composition is too balanced." She knew how to position herself. Did she plan to release this image? Perhaps. Or perhaps she wanted someone to find it later. To create pressure? Or legacy? Wolfe made a dismissive gesture. Legacy is a word for those who fear disappearance. Bryce returned the photo. Wolfe leaned in, resting his elbow on the chair's arm. "Mr. Bryce, someone broke into this office 3 nights ago. They searched for this photograph. I believe they wanted to confirm its existence and to gauge how much I know." Bryce blinked. "And you think I think," Wolfe said calmly, "that you have seen it before. I think you lied, but not for your own sake." Bryce didn't respond. "Go," Wolfe said. Bryce stood, adjusted his scarf, and exited without another word. After he left, I looked at Wolfe. Well? He did not come for answers. He came to see if I would press. Which means he knows more. Who do you think he's protecting? That, Wolfe murmured, is precisely what we must determine. He closed his eyes again, hands steepled, still as stone. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the ivy on the garden wall. Inside, Wolfe was gathering shadows, arranging them like chess pieces. Tomorrow, Bane and Rowena will return. And with them, Wolfe would tighten the net. Not with threats, but with silence and strategy. You know a man's importance when he arrives wearing elbow patches and doesn't look like a joke. Aldous Van Gelder was that kind of man. He showed up at Wolfe's door just past 10 in the morning, umbrella in hand despite the forecast being as dry as Fritz's wit. He looked like a man who spent his life in libraries and didn't entirely trust daylight. I liked him immediately. Wolfe didn't offer him beer. He offered him silence, and for Van Gelder, that was hospitality enough. The man lowered himself into the red chair with the stiff grace of someone who'd done this sort of thing before, though probably in lecture halls, not detective offices. I must say, Mr. Wolfe, he began in a voice made for quiet rooms and footnotes, I never expected to be summoned on a matter that smells of scandal. I've spent the better part of 10 years restoring medieval manuscripts. Ink doesn't gossip. Then let us consider you well suited to this, Wolfe said. We require clarity, not drama. I stood nearby, notebook ready, though I didn't expect to write much. Wolfe had that lean-forward stillness, the one that told me this was going to be a short conversation packed with weight. Mr. Van Gelder, Wolfe began, what can you tell me about the financial end of the Scarlet Glasshouse during its final years? Van Gelder gave a small, tired smile. It depended on 3 primary benefactors. Serafina Galt, of course, who provided the property and the central funding. A European horticulture trust based in Ghent anonymous board. And, briefly, a private American patron whose name was never disclosed publicly. Never? Wolfe asked. Never in my writings. But privately, yes. I learned it later through a series of correspondences Serafina kept in a locked drawer that had the unfortunate luck of being sold with a desk. And the name? Wolfe said. Van Gelder paused, looked at me, then back at Wolfe. You'll forgive the theatrics. I've kept this for years because I assumed the man wished to remain private. His contribution wasn't illegal, but it was complicated. Because? Because the donor was Lucian Harth. That got a reaction. From Wolfe a soft intake of breath. From me a mental scramble of puzzle pieces that had just spun around and snapped together in a new shape. You're sure? Wolfe said. Yes. He used an intermediary, of course, but the trail was clear. Bank transfers, coordinated shipments of rare bulbs, signed letters. He gave it under the name L. H. Wick. And this was after Talia's disappearance? I asked. Just before. The donations began in the spring, tapered by midsummer. Did anyone else know? Wolfe asked. Serafina. Possibly 1 or 2 others in the inner circle. But no one who would have had reason to connect the dots. Wolfe tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest. Why did he fund it? Van Gelder frowned. If I had to speculate, guilt. Or perhaps he believed the glasshouse would shelter her. Or enshrine her. That makes the orchid his message. Perhaps, Van Gelder said, but it could also make it her prison. Wolfe dismissed him gently, with a nod that Van Gelder returned like a man closing a book. As the door shut behind him, Wolfe turned to me. Find out, he said, what Lucian was protecting his sister, or himself. I was halfway out the door when the bell rang again. Fritz answered and returned quietly. Miss Cray had arrived. Rowena Cray entered the office with a grace that somehow sharpened the air. Her beige trench coat hung neatly over her arm, her hair was perfectly set, and her eyes, well, those eyes had the steady burn of someone who'd prepared her answers on the ride over. "Miss Cray," Wolfe said, motioning to the chair. She sat. "You told Mr. Goodwin that Talia wished to be remembered as a ghost. That she sought legacy through disappearance." "Yes," Rowena said. "She wanted to control the narrative. It was the one thing no one ever let her do." "Did she intend to vanish forever?" Rowena hesitated. "No. I don't believe so." "Then she planned to return. On her terms." Wolfe studied her. "Why didn't she?" "I don't know. You were close. She trusted you. Sometimes. But Talia's trust wasn't a gift. It was a transaction. And the price? Loyalty. Or silence?" Rowena didn't answer. Wolfe leaned forward just a touch. "What did she ask you to do, Miss Cray?" She folded her hands in her lap. "She gave me an envelope. Told me not to open it unless she didn't come back within a year." "Did you open it?" "Yes." "What was inside?" "A letter. And instructions for hiding the photograph. She wanted it buried in the greenhouse. She said it needed to be found, but only by someone looking for her." "And the second photograph?" Rowena stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie." I handed her the image we found at the Scarlet Glasshouse, the one of Talia planting the orchid. Rowena stared at it for a long time. "This wasn't in the envelope." "You're certain?" "Yes." Then someone else added a second layer. A second voice. Rowena looked up. "You think she was working with someone?" "No," Wolfe said. "I think someone was working through her." She blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," Wolfe replied, "that she may not have been the author of her own story." For a moment, Rowena looked ready to ask more. But then she closed her mouth, stood, and said only, "I kept her secret. I never thought I'd regret it." She left without another word. I sat with Wolfe in silence for a minute. He didn't speak, and neither did I. Then he said, "Call Lucian Harth. Tell him I must see him. Today." "Want to tell me why?" "He wrote checks under a false name. Funded an institution that disappeared his sister. Allowed her to vanish while claiming concern." "So he's the puppet master?" "No," Wolfe said. "He's the catalyst." I leaned back. "What do you mean?" "He set things in motion. He believed he could control the outcome. But the orchid was never his to control." "You think he's being played?" "I think he played himself." And with that, Wolfe reached for the photograph again and stared at it like a man reading a confession in botanical code. We were close. Not to a suspect, but to the reason. And sometimes, that's the more dangerous truth. You don't need to be a botanist to know that certain flowers only bloom when they're under stress. Some orchids won't open unless you force the temperature down, dry out the roots, and withhold light just long enough to make the plant think it's dying. Then when the moment's right they show their color. Nero Wolfe believed suspects worked the same way. Which is why, when Lucian Harth arrived just before 4 that afternoon, I knew the temperature was about to drop. He came alone. No driver, no coat, no pretense. Just a charcoal gray suit, one glove missing, and a look that could peel paint. I led him into the office without a word. Wolfe didn't rise, naturally. He simply nodded once and pointed to the red chair. Hearth sat without protest. I assume, he said, voice flat, you've discovered something. Several things, Wolfe replied. And many of them are yours. Lucian adjusted his cufflinks. They were gold, shaped like stylized lilies. Probably heirlooms. Probably worn for this occasion. I'm listening. Wolfe reached for the thin folder resting beside his beer glass. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. You funded the Scarlet Glasshouse. Hearth blinked once. That was never public. Van Gelder, I said. Found it in Galt's private letters. Hearth looked at me, then back at Wolfe. Yes. I funded it. Through an intermediary. Why? Wolfe asked. Because Talia asked me to. Generosity does not suit you. Hearth gave a humorless smile. She wanted to cultivate something rare. Something meaningful. She was tired of society. Tired of being looked at. She said the glasshouse was a place where no one would ask questions. And you agreed. I agreed to protect her. By hiding her? She was already disappearing. I simply gave her the means. Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly. Did you know she intended to vanish entirely? I suspected. She wrote me a letter just before she left. Said she needed time. Said not to look for her. Said if I did, it would undo everything. Do you still have the letter? No. Convenient. She asked me to burn it. I did. Wolfe drummed his fingers on the armrest. But you didn't stay away, did you? Hearth hesitated. You went to the glasshouse, Wolfe said. At least once. Possibly more. Yes, Hearth admitted. I went once. After she stopped writing. And? It was empty. She was gone. But the orchid remained. Hearth nodded. It had just bloomed. Crimson. I knew it was hers. Did you photograph her? No. Did you commission the photo? He paused. She arranged it. But I paid for it. I glanced at Wolfe. That was new. She said she wanted something to prove she'd lived. Something buried, like a time capsule. She made me promise not to release it. Not unless someone tried to rewrite her story. Wolfe's gaze hardened. And now someone has. Hearth didn't answer. He looked tired. Not theatrically tired, bone deep, restless tired. Like the kind that comes from rehearsing conversations that never happen. She was my sister, he said. And I failed her. Wolfe was quiet for a beat. Then you kept her memory in your pocket like a folded note. But someone else opened the envelope. I didn't quite follow that, but Hearth seemed to. She was planning something, Hearth said. A return. A revelation. Do you think she's alive? Wolfe asked. I did. For a long time. But now? He shook his head. Now I think someone wants me to believe she is. To what end? I'm not sure. Maybe to punish me. Or maybe to get something she left behind. That was interesting. I leaned forward. What would she have left behind that's worth all this trouble? Hearth turned his eyes to me. Talia was obsessive. She kept journals, letters, sketches. She wrote endlessly. And she never destroyed anything. Where is it? I don't know. She never kept anything in one place. But she once told me she had a safe garden. A space no one would think to look at. Another greenhouse? I asked. No. Something smaller. Wolfe tapped his temple with a finger. A clue inside a clue. The orchid, perhaps, was not the secret. It was the key. Hearth stood. If she's dead, I want her name cleared. If she's alive, he didn't finish. You'll be summoned again, Wolfe said. Be ready. Lucian nodded, and I walked him to the door. He paused at the threshold. Tell me something, Mr. Goodwin. Do you think she's out there? I met his eyes. I think she left a trail for someone to find. Whether she's still walking it, that's another matter. He gave a tight nod and left. Back in the office, Wolfe was staring at the two photographs again. One of Talia holding the orchid. The other of her planting it. She buried something, Wolfe murmured. Besides herself? I asked. Yes. He looked up at me. Call Bain. I want to see him again. Tonight. Same topic? No, Wolfe said. This time, I intend to press him on his past. Collier Bain arrived at 8, wearing the same coat, a looser tie, and the face of a man who'd been expecting this summons since the last one. He sat, fidgeted, and gave Wolfe a nervous smile. I'm not sure what else I can offer, he said. Wolfe didn't bother with pleasantries. Mr. Bain, where did you meet Talia? At a gallery opening. Bryce was curating a small collection. She was luminous. Did you correspond? Briefly. Then she asked me to meet her at the Galt estate. She invited you there? Yes. Said she needed someone who understood transformation. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Did she ask you to assist her with anything specific? Bain hesitated. She gave me a box. A box? Small. Wood. Said it contained something private. What did you do with it? She asked me to hide it. Where? I can't tell you. You can't or won't? Bain looked down. She made me promise. And now she's gone. I know. Wolfe's voice sharpened just slightly. You are aware that someone has been using Talia's memory to apply pressure to others' blackmail, if not worse. Bain nodded, shamefaced. Yes. And still you protect her? I protect what she asks of me. I don't know who's behind all this. But you know the box matters. Yes. Wolfe leaned back. Then the question becomes, who else knew of it? Bain blinked. No one. I was the only one she told. Are you sure? He thought for a moment. Then she wrote in her journal. Always. Maybe someone read them. Then the breach came later, Wolfe said, almost to himself. Someone found the box and used it to stage this theater. He turned to me. Archie, tomorrow we go hunting. Not for a suspect. For the object. If the orchid is the key, the box is the lock. Where do we start? Wolfe's lips curled in something not quite a smile. Where she planted it. But this time, we dig. When Nero Wolfe says we dig, he doesn't mean he digs. That's my cue to lace up my boots, roll up my sleeves, and head toward trouble with a trowel and a grumble. In this case, the trouble was in the forgotten corner of a defunct greenhouse once filled with secrets and still holding on to one. At 9:30 the following morning, I was back at the Galt estate, this time with a hand trowel, gloves, a flashlight, and Saul Panzer. Wolfe had insisted. "Someone," he said, "must watch your back. Not for safety. For silence." He meant Saul wasn't the type to narrate my incompetence. The greenhouse hadn't changed since our last visit. Still damp. Still filled with that peculiar aroma of dust, moss, and something floral that refused to die. The crimson epiphany wasn't visible, no shock there. That bloom had come and gone. But its place had been marked. Saul found the metal tag again, half buried under a film of old loam. We started digging. I don't mean shovels and backhoes. We weren't going to tunnel to China. But we did scrape and sift through a 6-foot area surrounding the original planting site. 15 minutes in, I found a splinter of wood. A sliver, really, stained and rotted but unmistakably shaped. Saul crouched next to me. More there. We cleared away another 2 inches of soil. Then, slowly, the rest of it emerged from a box. Mahogany, water-warped but intact. Roughly the size of a cigar humidor, with brass hinges and a rusted clasp. I didn't open it. Not yet. We sealed it in a bag and drove back to the brownstone. No detours. No chatter. We didn't even stop for coffee, which tells you how serious we were. Wolfe was waiting in the office. He didn't rise, didn't greet us. Just gestured to the desk. "Place it there." I did. He stared at it like it might bloom if he squinted hard enough. Then he nodded. "Open it, Archie." It took some gentle force. The clasp resisted, then gave with a soft snap. The box creaked open. Inside were 3 things. A folded letter sealed with red wax. A small leather-bound journal. And a bundle of photographs, wrapped in oil paper and tied with twine. No diamonds, no cash, no cursed relics. Just stories. Wolfe had me lay the contents out on the blotter one by one. He didn't touch them. He observed. Judged. Calculated. I opened the letter. The wax crumbled. Inside was a single sheet, written in Talia's sharp, slanted hand. "To the one who finds this, if you are reading these pages, then I have either failed in vanishing or succeeded too well. These are not confessions. They are roots. Let them reach who they must." I looked up. Wolfe's expression didn't change. "Continue." The journal was next. Unlike her earlier ones flowery, this one was direct. Names. Meetings. Schedules. Impressions. It read like a personal dossier of her final year before disappearing. There were entries on Bryce. On Bain. On Rowena. Even on her brother. But most interesting was a recurring name I hadn't heard yet, E.L. The initials popped up throughout the journal. Always in coded context. E.L. says the bloom is almost ready. E.L. insists the box must be buried with intention. E.L. has secrets inside secrets. Find E.L., I muttered. Wolfe said nothing. We unwrapped the photographs last. 7 in total. All different poses of Talia in the greenhouse. Most featured the orchid. In one, she sat beside it in profile. In another, she looked directly into the lens with a half-smile. But the final one was different. It showed her handing the orchid to someone. A man. Only the side of his face was visible/blurred slightly. But the hairline, the frame, the coat were enough. It was Maxwell Bryce. I stared at it. So he lied. Again. Wolfe nodded. Indeed. I placed the photo down carefully. Wolfe finally leaned forward and steepled his fingers. She trusted him, he said. For a moment. No, Wolfe corrected. She orchestrated this. Every image. Every note. Every absence. She was constructing a narrative through people. Through objects. The orchid, the journal, the photographs, they were her witnesses. To what? To betrayal. I thought about that. So who betrayed her? That, Wolfe said, is what we'll now determine with her testimony. The next move was classic Wolfe. He didn't send invites. He issued summons. By noon, 4 of them had gone out: Lucian Hearth, Maxwell Bryce, Rowena Cray, Collier Bain. The final gathering was imminent. Wolfe spent the afternoon in his chair, not speaking. He didn't read. He didn't sip beer. He simply sat there with the open journal before him, turning pages slowly, rereading, reabsorbing, realigning. At one point, he murmured to himself, "E.L. must be a mask." I asked, "You mean the name's fake?" "Or a role," he said. "Played by one of them." That made my skin crawl. A pseudonym can hide a lot more than a name. It can hide motive, pattern, guilt. At 4:15, Fritz arrived with the guest list. "They are here," he said. "All of them?" Wolfe asked. Fritz nodded. "They are waiting in the front room." "Bring them." I stood, adjusting my tie. "Are you ready for this?" I asked. Wolfe closed the journal. "No." He looked up at me. "I am prepared." That's Wolfe for you. Never ready. Always prepared. One by one, they entered. Hearth. Bryce. Bain. Rowena. All seated. All silent. All watching Wolfe. And Wolfe, from behind his desk, surveyed them like a judge waiting to deliver the first sentence. "This," he said, "is not a performance. Nor an inquiry. It is a reckoning." He let that hang in the air. I stepped back. The final act had begun. And Wolfe was about to deliver his verdict. But not before each of them was invited, not required to speak. To confess. To bloom or to wither. And we, the gardeners of truth, were ready with shears. There are few things in life as delicate as a room full of suspects, and fewer still as dangerous. Wolfe didn't need to remind me to stay quiet or keep watch. The moment the 4 of them, Lucian Hearth, Maxwell Bryce, Rowena Cray, and Collier Bain, settled into their assigned chairs in Wolfe's office, the air turned the texture of velvet stretched over wire. Wolfe didn't rise. He never did. He simply looked at each of them in turn, with the kind of gaze that felt more like a page being turned than a stare being given. "We are nearing the end of this," Wolfe began, "and that means your patience must hold just a little longer. Each of you has told pieces of the truth. But the whole of it remains buried like the orchid itself." Lucian Hearth adjusted his cuff. Bryce crossed his legs. Rowena sat very still, hands folded in her lap. Bain, jittery as ever, tapped the arm of his chair as if he'd started a rhythm and couldn't find the beat. Wolfe gestured to the small mahogany box on his desk. This was recovered yesterday morning from the grounds of the Galt estate. It contains a journal, several photographs, and a letter. He paused. A legacy. Or a trap. Depending on how you interpret it. Then let us hear it, Bryce said, toned smooth but laced with effort. Enough riddles. Wolfe arched a brow. You are eager today. I've been patient long enough. Patience is not the same as silence, Wolfe said. And you've practiced the latter only when convenient. Bryce's jaw flexed but he said nothing. Wolfe turned to Rowena. Miss Cray, you claimed Talia entrusted you with an envelope. One containing a single photograph. Yes. But there were more. I didn't know. You didn't ask. Rowena blinked. She made it clear I wasn't to ask. Wolfe nodded once. And you obeyed. She was fragile. But also dangerous when cornered. Lucian shifted at that. Wolfe noted it. Mr. Harth, Wolfe said, voice lowering, what was your sister's plan? Lucian took a breath. She wanted to disappear. Create a myth. Leave behind symbols, not explanations. I didn't help her plan it. I only tried to give her space to succeed. You funded the glasshouse. Yes. You paid for the photograph. He nodded. But she composed it. Every frame. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. Then tell me this. Who is E.L.? Lucian froze. You read the journal, Wolfe continued. You know the name. I don't know who it is, Lucian said. Wolfe grunted. Pfui. She used the initials repeatedly in her final entries. E.L. arranged her final correspondence. E.L. oversaw the preservation of this box. E.L. instructed her on how to construct her narrative. Bain's knee started bouncing. Wolfe turned to him. Mr. Bain, do you know who E.L. is? I don't. You were entrusted with her writings. I thought she was talking about herself. That it was a metaphor. E.L. is not a metaphor. Bain looked away. Rowena glanced sideways at him, then back to Wolfe. It wasn't me, she said quietly. She never called me that. Wolfe nodded once. Nor was it Bryce. Talia referred to him always as the collector. She described E.L. as someone close, but hidden. A guide. A confidant. Lucian's voice cut through. You think it was me? No, Wolfe said simply. You were the sponsor. But not the strategist. He reached into the box and removed the final photo, Talia handing the orchid to a shadowed man. He didn't pass it around. You all know this photograph, Wolfe said. Or you should. It was taken just days before she vanished. She's giving the orchid to someone she trusted. The angle of her body suggests comfort. The tilt of her head, vulnerability. And who is it? Bryce asked. Wolfe looked at him. You. Bryce didn't flinch. I told you I didn't take it. That doesn't mean I wasn't there. You told me you didn't photograph her. But you did appear in a photograph with her. A significant difference. Bryce shrugged. Semantics. No, Wolfe snapped, strategy. Everyone went quiet. Wolfe tapped the desk. She allowed you to witness it. But not to own it. She recorded everything but gave no one full possession. That's how she maintained control. Rowena spoke softly. She was building something. Wolfe nodded. Yes. Not a myth. A weapon. Bain stood suddenly, hands shaking. This is ridiculous. Sit, Wolfe said. He didn't raise his voice. Bain sat. Wolfe glanced toward me. I opened the journal to the marked page and read aloud. E.L. told me the box must be hidden with intent. Not buried like trash. Planted like a seed. So that whoever finds it is changed by it. Wolfe steepled his fingers. She expected someone to find it. But not just anyone. Someone she believed would understand the code. Code? Lucian asked. Yes, Wolfe said. The box is the key. But there is a second location. A final one. She hinted at it repeatedly. A safe garden. A room without windows. A place where orchids do not bloom, but truth does. Rowena whispered, that sounds like a greenhouse. No, Wolfe corrected. A crypt. That pulled a sharp silence across the room. Her journal mentions a vault, Wolfe continued. An old root cellar, locked for years, repurposed by the Galt estate as an archival storage room. Records say it was sealed just 2 days after her disappearance. Bain's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. You knew, Wolfe said quietly. You knew, Wolfe repeated, louder. You helped her hide this box, but you also helped someone else hide what came after. Bryce looked at Bain sharply. What does he mean? Bain didn't answer. Wolfe stood. Slowly. Deliberately. In that cellar is the remainder of her archive. Her full letters. Her statements. Her intent. And perhaps her truth. He looked around the room. I will retrieve it. And when I do, one of you will be undone. He turned to me. Archie. Prepare a team. Tomorrow morning, we return to the Galt estate. I nodded. Lucian stood abruptly. If she's alive, Wolfe said, she will have chosen now to return. And if she's not, we must hear her final voice. Rowena was pale. Bryce was tense. Bain was trembling. Wolfe stepped back behind his desk and lowered himself into the chair. None of you will leave the city. None of you will destroy anything further. If I learn you have, he didn't finish the threat. He didn't have to. As the guests filed out slowly, silent, stunned eyes stood beside Wolfe. He looked at me. She was never trying to vanish, he said. She was trying to be heard. And now? He looked down at the journal. Now, Archie, she's about to speak. We arrived at the Galt estate the next morning just as the sun slipped over the treetops, turning the dead greenhouse glass into a mirror of light. Wolfe had insisted on coming in, a rare concession to circumstance and, possibly, to sentiment. He loathed fieldwork the way a cat loathes rain, but some truths need to be confronted on soil, not paper. Fritz drove us. Saul came armed with tools, Archie Goodwin with a flashlight, a crowbar, and a borrowed permit to enter the property in pursuit of sealed archival property language Wolfe had dictated, naturally. The root cellar lay beneath the east garden wall, past the rusted fountain and under a cracked marble urn that had long since surrendered to the moss. A slab of stone marked the entrance, once sealed, now mostly forgotten. Saul cleared away the overgrowth and wedged the crowbar into the seal. With a groan like the throat of an old man preparing to speak, the hatch lifted. The air that rose was cold, dry, layered with the scent of old wood, faint mold, and something sharper paper, preserved against time. Wolfe refused to descend. He stood at the edge, his hands behind his back, and directed from above. I went down first. The cellar had intact stone walls, wooden shelves, everything in place but covered in dust like snow. In the far corner, tucked behind a row of wine crates and what looked like sealed ledgers, was a trunk. Not a box. A trunk. Leather-bound, iron-riveted, and locked. Saul made quick work of the clasp. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Stacked neatly in waxed envelopes. Photographs, some duplicates of the ones we'd already seen. And notebooks. 3, to be exact. Each labeled in Talia Harth's precise hand Volume I Appearances. Volume 2 Orchestration. Volume 3 Echo. The final volume was thinner than the rest. I opened it and flipped to the last written page. There, in ink that hadn't yet faded, was the last line she ever wrote. Someone must remember me as I was, not how I was made. I carried the notebooks back up into the light. Wolfe didn't touch them. He didn't need to. She wrote her own eulogy, he said. Or her resurrection, I replied. We returned to the brownstone in silence. That evening, the suspects returned one final time. Lucian. Bryce. Rowena. Bain. They entered with the hesitance of people who knew they were not here to debate, but to be told. Fritz served nothing. Wolfe offered no chairs. He remained seated. The rest stood like students called before a headmaster who already knew the answers. Wolfe began without preamble. 6 years ago, Talia Harth vanished. The world presumed a scandal. Some suspected death. Her brother suspected drama. But she was enacting something else at removal. A self-edit. He looked to Lucian. She wanted you to be silent, not absent. You misunderstood her. Lucian swallowed. To vanish is one act, Wolfe continued. To vanish while planting a memory is another. He turned to Bain. You knew more than you admitted. Talia gave you the first box because she trusted your inability to lie well. Bain bristled. I didn't hurt her. But you enabled the person who did. Wolfe let that settle. He reached for the second journal volume I and opened it. In here, he said, she describes a pattern. Someone visited her 3 times in her final weeks. Someone told her she was wasting her gift. That she should leave not just a trace but a tragedy. His eyes moved to Bryce. Mr. Bryce. You fancied yourself her archivist. But you were her editor. You trimmed what didn't suit your aesthetic. She entrusted you with images. You modified them. Destroyed others. Bryce's lips curled. That's absurd. You photographed her, Wolfe said. You helped her stage her disappearance. But when she hesitated, when she wanted to stay, you made a choice. I didn't. You leaked the photo, Wolfe interrupted, voice steady but final. You sent it to a society columnist anonymously. You let it fester until Lucian paid to bury it again. You cultivated mystery not for her sake, but for yours. Bryce's face was pale. You can't prove I can, Wolfe said. You signed one of the glass negatives. With a scratch mark your habit. S.G. The same initials on the back of the original photograph. Bryce took a step back. So what? I helped her. I made her important. You made her a product, Wolfe said. And when she refused to disappear properly, you erased her. Rowena spoke then, quietly. I knew she was scared. You did, Wolfe said. And you did nothing. Wolfe turned the page. In Volume 3, she says this: he told me I would be remembered if I let go. But I wanted more than that. I wanted to speak. Wolfe looked at each of them. She was never asking to be hidden. She was asking to be heard. Lucian's voice cracked. Is she alive? Wolfe didn't answer immediately. Then no. She died from exposure. Her body was found 3 years ago in a field in western Vermont. The authorities misidentified her. She had no ID. No prints on file. No history. Lucian closed his eyes. She wrote one last letter, Wolfe said. Unmailed. In the trunk. Addressed simply to whoever is left. Wolfe held up the letter but didn't read it aloud. In it, she said she feared being claimed, not remembered, not missed, but used. She feared each of you would fashion her story into your own tool. He turned to Bryce. And you did. Bryce didn't speak. Wolfe leaned back, exhausted from speaking more in one sitting than most men speak in a week. The crime was not murder. It was manipulation. A theft of voice. A slow erosion of a woman's control over her own narrative. He closed the journal. Mr. Harth, Wolfe said, you will take possession of her writings. You will decide what becomes of them. Lucian nodded, silent. To the rest of you, Wolfe continued, I offer no justice. No charges. Only shame. He gestured to the door. One by one, you may go. Rowena left first, chin lifted but eyes down. Bain followed, shoulders sagging. Bryce lingered, then stepped out without another word. Lucian was last. He turned at the door. Thank you, he said. For seeing her. Wolfe nodded once. She asked to be seen. When the door closed, Wolfe reached for his beer, took a long sip, and set it down. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, to be remembered truthfully, Archie, that is the rarest form of survival. I nodded. And to vanish on your own terms? Wolfe's mouth twitched. Unusual. But not unprecedented. I stood, stretched, and started toward the hallway. You know, I said, next time someone wants to disappear, I'd appreciate it if they skipped the horticulture. Easier to hide a person than an orchid. He grunted. And behind me, the office filled again with silence. Not the kind that smothers. The kind that honors.